The air inside Dane County Courthouse was heavy with the scent of polished wood and old paper. When Ella Carmichael entered the courtroom, the room barely noticed her at first, a small woman in a modest gray coat, her silver hair tied back neatly, hands trembling slightly as she held her purse. But when she looked toward the front, her gaze found Emily, her daughter, sitting beside Mark Reed, her son-in-law. The sight stopped her heart for a moment. Emily avoided eye contact, pretending to rearrange the papers in front of her. Mark, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips, the kind that said he already knew how this would end. To him, Ella wasn't a person anymore. She was an obstacle, a burden to be removed politely and efficiently. Then the clerk called her name, Mrs. Ella Carmichael. She rose, the small courtroom suddenly too large for her. But before she could step forward, the judge looked up from his file, a man in his early 60s with kind eyes that suddenly widened. Mrs. Carmichael? Is that really you? The murmur that followed swept through the courtroom like a cold draft. Emily froze. Mark's confidence faltered. The judge's voice softened. You worked here, didn't you? Years ago when I was just a clerk. Ella managed a gentle nod. Yes, Your Honor. It's been a long time. Silence fell again, the kind that carries weight. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum quieter. For a brief second, Ella saw not the courtroom, but the life that had led her here, the quiet mornings 6 months ago when everything still felt safe. She used to wake early, open the curtains, and greet the small garden Robert had planted before he passed. Roses, tulips, and the same lavender bush he'd insisted would outlive them both. Her mornings began with the same ritual, 1 cup of coffee in the old blue mug that still bore a chip on its rim. She always kept Robert's favorite chair across from hers, never moving it. Neighbors would wave as she watered the flowers, and she'd smile, thinking life, though smaller now, was still kind. Her daughter called sometimes, her voice always rushed. Sorry, Mom, work's insane this week. Ella understood. Emily had a life, a husband, ambitions. That's what she had raised her for. When Robert died, Ella had believed grief would pull them closer. She imagined Sunday dinners, the laughter of grandchildren, a home still filled with noise. Instead, she found herself standing outside her daughter's new house, waiting longer and longer for the door to open each visit. Mark often greeted her with polite impatience, his smile sharp as glass. And Emily, once her little girl who clung to her hand, now seemed to glance at her like at a fragile vase she didn't know where to place. As Judge Kingston cleared his throat and the proceedings began, Ella sat quietly, folding her hands on her lap. The walls around her felt colder than any winter in Madison. She looked at Emily, her only child, and thought, with a quiet ache, that she no longer recognized the woman sitting there. She had no idea that her quiet life was about to be torn apart. The rain had been falling since morning, tapping against the windows of Ella's old house like an impatient visitor. By the time Emily and Mark arrived that October afternoon, the sky had already turned the color of slate, and puddles had begun to form along the porch steps. Ella opened the door with a smile she hoped would feel natural, but it faltered when she saw the manila folder in Mark's hand. "Mom," Mark said smoothly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "This house is too big for you." His tone carried the same practiced warmth he used when talking to clients at his firm, courteous, polished, empty. Emily followed behind him, clutching her umbrella, her eyes darting from the walls to the family photos that still hung neatly in the hallway. "It's not safe for you to be alone anymore," she added gently. "We've been looking into an assisted living facility. It's really nice, Mom. They have medical staff, private rooms, even a garden." Ella's hand tightened around the edge of the kitchen table. "A facility?" she echoed softly, her voice almost lost beneath the rain. "Emily, I'm fine here. This is my home. Mark placed the folder down on the table and slid it toward her. We're just trying to help, he said. You'll be happier there, more care, more company. You can sell this place and live comfortably. She didn't touch the papers. Her gaze drifted past him, toward the staircase where Emily had once sat crying after her first day of school, the spot where Robert used to hang his coat after work. Every inch of this house carried the weight of her life. Birthdays, holidays, nights spent waiting for the sound of her daughter's car pulling into the driveway. I don't need care, she said quietly. I need family. Emily hesitated. For a fleeting second, guilt crossed her face, but Mark's hand on her shoulder pulled her back to composure. Mom, he said, his tone tightening, we're not trying to upset you. But last week, you left the stove on. The neighbor smelled gas. Ella blinked, confused. The stove. She searched her memory, but nothing came. I didn't, Mark sighed, cutting her off. It's okay, it happens. You're getting older, and we just want you safe. She looked from him to Emily, desperate for her daughter to say something, anything to defend her. But Emily only looked down, her lips pressed thin. The conversation drifted after that, filled with polite words that cut sharper than any argument. They talked about options and safety and future plans, the vocabulary of people who had already made a decision. Ella simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. When they finally left, the door closed with a softness that felt cruel. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the sound of the old clock ticking in the hallway. Ella stood for a long time, staring at the papers they'd left on the table, still untouched, the ink already curling slightly at the edges from the damp air. Then she walked to the window and watched their car pull away. Through the glass, she caught one last glimpse of Mark's face, that faint, satisfied smile as he spoke to Emily. It wasn't concern she saw there. It was ambition, cold, deliberate, and frighteningly calm. And in that moment, as thunder rolled far in the distance, Ella realized something she hadn't wanted to believe. She was no longer family to them. She was an asset. That night, the house felt heavier than usual. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the damp chill of October, seeping through the old wooden frames of the windows. Ella sat in her armchair, the lamp casting a pool of yellow light over the papers still lying on the table. Her tea had gone cold hours ago. She had tried to read the documents, but every word blurred together. Transfer of property, medical supervision, power of attorney. It was as if her own life had been reduced to legal clauses and signatures. She was about to stand when a sound caught her attention, the creak of the front door. Her heart jumped. Footsteps followed, careful, hushed. Ella turned off the lamp, holding her breath. Voices drifted in from the hallway. I told you she'd sign if we pushed the doctor's report, Mark whispered. Emily's voice was quieter, hesitant. But she's fine, Mark. She's not confused. She left the stove on, he interrupted sharply. That's all it takes. Once Dr. Reeves confirms it, we can get her declared legally incompetent. It's standard procedure. Then we can sell the house before winter. There was a long silence. Then Emily's voice again, trembling. It's Mom's house. It was her husband's, Mark corrected, his tone cold. We need to move fast before she realizes what those papers mean. Ella's fingers dug into the armrest of her chair. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The word stung worse than any insult. Declared incompetent, like she was a burden to be managed, not a person. The house that held her life. The garden Robert had planted, even the chipped blue mug, all of it reduced to property on paper. She heard the door close again, their voices fading into the night. Only the ticking of the old clock remained. Ella sat frozen, her pulse echoing in her ears. She thought of Emily, the little girl who once used to bring her drawings to bed, who used to whisper, I'll never leave you. Mommy. What had gone so wrong that her daughter could stand by while this man planned to erase her? The pain rose first, sharp, suffocating. But beneath it, something else began to stir. It was quiet at first, like a slow current under the surface of still water. Then it grew, steadier, stronger. Anger. It wasn't loud or reckless. It was clean, cold, and clear, a refusal to vanish. She had spent her entire life caring for others, maybe just once. It was time to protect herself. Her gaze drifted toward the darkened hallway. Beyond it lay Robert's study, the room she hadn't entered since the day he died. His desk was still there, his books untouched, his scent faintly lingering in the air whenever the door creaked open. And then she remembered. His voice, calm and certain. From years ago, if anything ever happens to me, check my study. Her breath caught. Slowly, she rose from the chair, the old floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The fear that had once paralyzed her began to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve that filled the silence like dawn breaking after a storm. Ella turned off the hallway light, staring into the darkness where Robert's study waited. She knew now she was done being afraid. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Ella moved through the hallway with a flashlight in one hand, her robe brushing against the floor. When she reached the study, her breath caught. The door hadn't been opened since Robert's funeral. The brass handle was cold, and as she turned it, the hinges groaned as if the room itself were waking from a long sleep. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the scent of paper and time. Everything was just as he'd left it. The mahogany desk stood neatly arranged, his fountain pen still resting beside an old notepad filled with numbers she didn't understand. A pair of reading glasses lay folded atop a newspaper dated 6 years ago. She hesitated before touching anything, her fingers trembling. "Robert," she whispered, almost expecting him to answer. She scanned the room, trying to imagine what he'd meant. Check my study. But check for what? Her eyes landed on the bookshelf against the far wall. Rows of law journals and ledgers, thick with dust. She remembered how Robert used to joke that the books held everything a man needs to survive, though she'd always thought he meant it metaphorically. On instinct, she ran her hand along the edge of the shelves. One of the panels felt slightly different, smoother, newer. She leaned closer, pressing her palm against it. There was a hollow sound. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed the edge of the shelf and pulled gently. To her surprise, the entire section shifted forward an inch. Behind it, the beam of her flashlight caught something metallic, a small steel safe built into the wall. Her heart pounded. She hadn't known he even owned a safe. Kneeling down, she brushed away the thin layer of dust and examined the dial. For several minutes, she just stared, uncertain where to start. Then a thought came to her. Their wedding anniversary. She turned the dial, entered the numbers, and pulled the handle. Nothing. She tried again. This time the date they'd bought the house. Still nothing. Her hand hovered over the dial, and she closed her eyes. If anything ever happens to me, check my study. His voice echoed again, tender and sure. Then another memory surfaced. The day they met. A church fundraiser in Milwaukee. He'd spilled coffee on her dress. Apologized so earnestly she'd laughed. August 17th, 1972. With trembling fingers, she entered the date. The safe clicked. Inside was a small stack of neatly bound envelopes, a worn leather folder, and a single sealed letter addressed to Ella M. Carmichael. She lifted the letter first, unfolding it with care. Robert's handwriting was strong and steady, the same she'd seen on every note he ever left her. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I've set things up to make sure you'll never be left helpless. The assets in this folder, the apartment, the stocks, the bank accounts, they're all under your name. Protect yourself with this. Don't let anyone decide your worth. You've carried this family all your life. Now, let these papers carry you. Her vision blurred. She pressed the page to her chest, her shoulders shaking. With trembling hands, she opened the folder. Inside were property deeds, investment records, and account statements. Her eyes widened as she recognized an address. 112 Brookfield Avenue. That was Emily and Mark's condo. The deed listed only one name, Ella M. Carmichael. She stared at it for a long moment, unable to breathe. All this time, while they looked down on her, while they planned to take her house, they were living in a home she still owned. The truth hit her like thunder, a mix of disbelief, sorrow, and a strange, burning satisfaction. Tears streamed down her face as she sank to the floor, the letter still clutched in her hand. You always knew this day would come. Didn't you, Robert? She whispered through a trembling smile. And in the quiet glow of the flashlight, surrounded by the ghosts of their shared life, Ella Carmichael began to understand that Robert hadn't just left her memories. He had left her power. The following morning, Ella sat in the waiting room of Davenport and Associates, the faint hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. Outside, Madison was waking under a pale winter sun, the streets still slick with rain. She had barely slept. The letter from Robert, the deeds, the numbers, they had replayed in her mind all night like a secret she wasn't sure she deserved to hold. But now she was here, clutching a folder that felt heavier than it looked. A young receptionist led her into a modest office lined with legal books. Behind the desk sat a woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm that immediately steadied the room. Mrs. Carmichael, she said, standing to shake her hand. Lisa Davenport, elder law specialist. Please have a seat. Ella sat carefully, her purse balanced on her lap. I found something, she began. My husband, Robert. Passed 6 years ago. He left me this letter and these documents. I think he knew I'd need them one day. Lisa opened the folder, scanning the first few pages. Her brow lifted slightly. Well, she said, flipping through the deeds, your husband was meticulous. Stocks, property titles. This is quite comprehensive. She paused at one paper, her tone shifting. Ah, here it is, the behavioral clause. Ella looked up. The what? It's rare, but it's valid, Lisa explained. It's a provision in his will stating that any heirs who fail to treat you with respect and care for your well-being forfeit their inheritance. Smart man. It's what we call an ethical safeguard. And, she added, tapping the document lightly, he ensured all the assets were legally under your name. That means your daughter and son-in-law can't sell or transfer anything without your consent. For a moment, Ella just stared. Relief washed through her, followed by guilt. He must have known, she murmured. Robert always thought ahead. Lisa leaned back, thoughtful. They'll likely try to prove you're unfit to manage your affairs. That's the most common route. If they can get a competency declaration, they can challenge ownership. We'll need to get ahead of them. How? Lisa's eyes sharpened. By giving them what they want, or at least what they think they want. Ella frowned. You're going to let them believe you're vulnerable, Lisa continued. Confused, uncertain. Let them talk freely, show their hand. Every insult, every manipulation, record it. We'll build a case for elder financial abuse. But you must be careful. This isn't revenge. Mrs. Carmichael. It's protection. Quiet, deliberate protection. Ella hesitated, her heart pounding. The idea of pretending weakness felt humiliating. But then she remembered Mark's voice in the dark, the cold calculation in his words. Declare her incompetent. No, not this time. I can do that, she said finally, her voice steady. Lisa nodded approvingly. Good. Keep the documents safe. Don't let them know you've spoken to me. When the time comes, we'll be ready. When Ella stepped back into the crisp afternoon air, she stood for a long while on the sidewalk, watching the wind rustle the bare branches of the courthouse park across the street. The weight she carried was no lighter, but now it had shape, purpose. By the time she reached home, she knew what she had to do. She placed her walking cane by the door, let her hands tremble just enough, and took a deep breath. The performance began, the frail, forgetful widow they thought she was. Only this time, she was the one writing the script. The wind rattled the windows that afternoon, carrying with it the chill of early November. Inside, the air felt heavier than usual, quiet waiting. Ella sat at the dining table, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, a pot of tea steaming between two untouched cups. Across from her, Mark Reed was spreading out documents with the self-assurance of a man who believed he'd already won. Emily stood behind him, pale and silent, her arms folded tightly as though trying to hold herself together. "Mom," Mark began smoothly, "we really appreciate you agreeing to this. It's for your own good." His tone was honeyed, professional, each word coated in concern but laced with impatience. "This transfer will make sure everything runs smoothly. You'll be free of responsibility, and Emily and I can handle the maintenance, the taxes, the stress." Ella nodded faintly, her eyes downcast. "I'm sure you know best," she murmured, her voice trembling just enough to sound fragile. Emily's eyes softened, perhaps believing her mother had finally accepted it. "It's what Dad would have wanted," she said quietly. That sentence almost broke her composure, but Ella managed a small, weary smile. "Yes, your father always wanted peace." Mark slid a pen across the table. "Just sign here, Mom. Then we can all move forward." She took the pen, her hand shaking as she hovered over the paper. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the raw, steady pulse of everything she'd endured. The deception, the gaslighting, the loneliness. She lowered the pen, touched it to the paper, and then right on cue the doorbell rang. Mark's head snapped up, irritation flashing across his face. "Were you expecting someone?" Ella blinked innocently. "Oh, I think that must be Mrs. Lewis from next door. She said she'd bring me soup." "Can it wait?" he muttered. But Ella was already rising, shuffling toward the door with deliberate slowness. When she opened it, the chill from outside swept in, along with three figures. Attorney Lisa Davenport stepped in first, followed by a court officer in uniform and a woman carrying a clipboard. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carmichael," Lisa said brightly. "Sorry to interrupt. I believe you're in the middle of signing some very important papers." Mark froze. "Excuse me, who are you?" Lisa flashed her badge. "Attorney Lisa Davenport, representing Mrs. Carmichael. And this," she gestured to the uniformed man, "is Officer Grant from Dane County, accompanied by MS. Hayes from Adult Protective Services." Color drained from Mark's face. "This is absurd. You can't just barge in." "Oh, I can," Lisa cut in smoothly. "We have an active investigation under Wisconsin Statute 46.90, elder financial abuse." The words hit the air like thunder. Emily's hand flew to her mouth. Lisa continued, calm but unyielding. "We have recorded evidence of coercion, emotional manipulation, and attempts to obtain property through deceit. Mrs. Carmichael has also retained ownership of several assets that Mr. Reed and Mrs. Reed have attempted to claim, including," she flipped a folder open, "the condo at 112 Brookfield Avenue." Mark's composure shattered. "That property, you live in it, Mr. Reed," Lisa said, her tone precise. "But you do not own it. It belongs solely to Mrs. Carmichael, and as of this morning, a restraining order has been filed preventing any further contact or transfer of her estate without legal supervision." Emily's voice cracked. "Mark, is that true?" Mark turned to her, eyes blazing. "They're twisting this. It's her word against." Lisa lifted a small recording device from her bag and pressed play. Mark's own voice filled the room, cold, confident, unmistakable. "Once Dr. Reeves confirms it, we can get her declared legally incompetent." The silence that followed was absolute. Emily covered her face, sobbing. Mark stumbled back, realizing the walls were closing in. The officer stepped forward. "Mr. Reed, we'll need you to come with us for questioning." As Mark protested, his voice echoing uselessly, Ella stood quietly by the table, her hands folded. Her heart didn't race this time. It was steady, calm, like still water after a storm. Emily looked at her through tears. "Mom, I didn't know. I swear I didn't." Ella's voice was gentle but firm. "You didn't want to know." Officer Grant led Mark outside, the door closing behind them with a satisfying click. Lisa exhaled and turned to Ella. "It's over for now. We'll finalize the proceedings next week." Ella gave a small nod, her eyes on the documents, still lying on the table. Then she said softly, with a composure that silenced the room, "I didn't fight you. I defended myself." And for the first time in months, the house didn't feel like a prison. It felt like hers again. A week later, the world outside had quieted again. Snow dusted the roofs of the houses on Carmichael Street, softening the hard edges left behind by autumn. Inside Ella's home, the warmth from the fireplace flickered across the walls, though her thoughts were as still as the air around her. Lisa had called earlier that morning. The investigation was moving quickly. Mark Reed, under mounting pressure, had reached out through his attorney with a proposal. He wanted to avoid public charges. He was willing to return full ownership of all property, surrender his control over the bank accounts, and his words, negotiate a peaceful resolution. When Lisa read the terms aloud, Ella had laughed softly. "Peaceful resolution," she'd repeated, as if the phrase itself were a punchline. Now, as she sat at the kitchen table, she read through the official settlement draft. Mark's offer included a request to remain in the Brookfield Avenue condo for 6 months. Ella picked up her pen and made a single change to the document. She increased the rent by 50%. No more favors. No more pretending family was immunity. Lisa reviewed the update and nodded. "You've earned this, Ella. Dignity isn't revenge. It's balance restored." By afternoon, the papers were signed and delivered. Mark accepted the terms without argument. For the first time, he sounded tired, broken. Emily didn't sign anything. She hadn't been seen since the hearing. Word had reached Ella through Lisa that Emily had filed for separation. The illusion of their marriage, built on manipulation and pride, had finally collapsed. That night, Ella sat by the window with a blanket around her shoulders. Snowflakes drifted past the glass like quiet ghosts. The house no longer felt haunted. Every creak, every draft belonged to her again. When the knock came just after 9, she already knew who it was. Emily stood on the porch, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. In her hands was a small wooden box. "Mom," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, can I come in?" Ella nodded and stepped aside. Emily set the box on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were the things she'd taken when she'd moved in with Mark. Her mother's pearls, Robert's pocket watch, old family photographs, even the faded birthday cards Ella had written her as a child. "I don't want them any more," Emily whispered. "They belong here. I'm sorry, Mom. For all of it. For believing him. For forgetting who you are." Ella reached out, brushing her daughter's hand lightly. For a moment, neither spoke. There were no speeches, no dramatic tears, just the quiet weight of regret and forgiveness, fragile and real. When Emily finally broke down, sobbing against her mother's shoulder, Ella didn't cry. Her eyes stayed dry, calm, resolute, because for the first time in years, she didn't feel powerless. She didn't feel small. She felt whole again. A year later, the Carmichael house no longer felt like a battlefield. The walls had been repainted, the windows replaced. The air filled once again with the soft scent of lavender from the garden Robert once tended. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a brass plaque engraved with quiet dignity. The Robert Carmichael Foundation for Elder Rights, established 2024. What had begun as an idea scribbled in Ella's notebook had grown into something real, a registered nonprofit housed in a modest downtown Madison office. Its mission was simple but vital: to provide free legal aid for elderly citizens suffering financial or emotional abuse. Lisa Davenport served as the foundation's legal advisor, guiding Ella through the endless paperwork and early challenges. "You're building something your husband would have been proud of," Lisa told her at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. But the biggest surprise came months later, when Ella received a letter in neat, careful handwriting. "Dear Mom, I've been volunteering at a local shelter for seniors these past few months. I'd like to do more. If there's a place for me at your foundation, even as a clerk or assistant, I'd be grateful. Love, Emily." Ella read the letter twice before folding it against her chest. Forgiveness wasn't a decision, it was a process, slow and uncertain. Still, she sent a reply the next day, come Monday morning. "We'll talk." When Emily arrived, the staff greeted her politely but warily. Some of them knew the story. Whispers traveled fast in a small office. She sensed their skepticism but said nothing. Instead, she threw herself into the work, answering phones, organizing client files, staying late to help Lisa prepare case summaries. Weeks passed. Her effort didn't go unnoticed. Ella would often find her daughter sitting with clients, listening with genuine patience, offering comfort to those who reminded her of the woman she'd once nearly betrayed. The distance between them began to shrink, replaced by small gestures, shared lunches, the occasional laugh over old stories, quiet moments where words weren't needed. One Friday evening, after the last staff member left, Emily lingered by the window overlooking the Capitol Dome. "You were right about Dad," she said softly. "He always believed in second chances, even when we didn't deserve them." Ella smiled, setting down her cup of tea. "He believed you'd find your way back." They sat together at the small conference table. A simple dinner spread between them, roasted vegetables, bread, and the apple pie Emily had baked from her father's old recipe. For the first time in years, the air between them was easy. Later that night, when Emily had gone home, Ella stepped into the garden. The moonlight spilled gently across the flower beds, the same place where she and Robert used to sit on summer evenings. She looked toward the empty chair that still stood beneath the oak tree and felt a calm she hadn't known in years. The pain that once defined her life had turned into something quieter, something that no longer hurt to touch. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, the scent of lavender thick in the air. For the first time since Robert's death, Ella Carmichael felt whole. Not because she had one, but because she had healed. The Dane County Courthouse felt different this time. The light was colder, sharper, and the echo of footsteps against the marble floor sounded heavier than it had a year before. Ella Carmichael sat quietly near the front row, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap. Beside her, Emily kept her eyes lowered, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. Across the aisle, Mark Reed sat between two deputies, his wrists cuffed loosely in front of him. His once carefully groomed hair had grown uneven, his suit now a shade too large. He glanced toward the benches, but looked away the moment his eyes met Ella's. The courtroom was nearly full, reporters, victims, families. Mark had finally been caught for what he'd done beyond their family. A string of financial scams targeting elderly widows across Wisconsin and Minnesota. He had used the same methods, the same charm, the same rehearsed sympathy. This time, though, there was no manipulation clever enough to save him. Judge Paul Kingston entered the room. His presence commanded silence. Time had silvered his hair since Ella last saw him, but his gaze was as steady as ever. When the hearing began, the prosecution detailed Mark's pattern of deceit: falsified medical reports, coerced power of attorney documents, joint accounts drained within months. They called witnesses one by one, women who'd once trusted him, who now sat trembling behind the microphone, their voices breaking as they described how he'd taken everything. And then it was Ella's turn. She rose slowly, leaning slightly on her cane as she approached the stand. The oath felt heavier this time, the words landing with meaning she'd earned through pain. "Mrs. Carmichael," the prosecutor began, "you were one of Mr. Reed's earlier victims." "Correct." "I was his mother-in-law," Ella said calmly. "He tried to make me believe I was losing my mind." Her voice carried through the room, clear, unwavering. She recounted the manipulation, the staged concern, the false medical evaluation. Each detail painted a picture of quiet cruelty. Emily listened with tears streaming silently down her face. When the defense attorney stood for cross-examination, his tone was sharp, almost mocking. "Mrs. Carmichael, at your age, it's understandable that memories can fade. You're certain about the dates and conversations you're describing." Ella's expression didn't change. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but powerful. "I remember every word," she said. "Every date. Every lie they told me." The courtroom went still. Even the court stenographer paused for half a second before continuing to type. Judge Kingston watched her for a moment, then gave a single approving nod. It wasn't sympathy, it was respect. He remembered her now, the woman who had once trained him when he was a nervous clerk fresh out of law school. She had shown him how to file motions, how to look beyond paperwork and see the human being behind each case. When she stepped down from the stand, he met her gaze briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. After several hours of testimony and deliberation, the verdict came. The foreperson stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Reed, guilty on all counts." Mark's shoulders sagged. Emily sobbed quietly, pressing a hand to her mouth. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber. "Mr. Reed, you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with no eligibility for parole until you have served at least 9. As the deputies led Mark away, he glanced over his shoulder, not defiant anymore, only hollow. Ella watched him go, not with triumph, but with an exhausted kind of peace. When she turned toward Emily, their eyes met. Neither spoke. But the tears that filled both their eyes said what words could not. Justice had been served, not the loud, vengeful kind, but the quiet kind that restores what was broken. And as Ella sat back down, her hand steady, she realized that for the first time in a very long while, the weight she'd been carrying was finally gone. 5 years later, the city of Madison was awash in spring light. Tulips lined the courthouse steps, and banners fluttered across State Street bearing the same message: the Carmichael Act for the Protection of Seniors, celebrating 5 years of change. The bill, inspired by Ella's case and championed by local representatives, had reshaped elder law across Wisconsin. It strengthened oversight on power of attorney transfers, mandated counseling before property handovers, and funded statewide programs to prevent exploitation. At 75, Ella Carmichael moved more slowly now, but her presence carried quiet authority. She stood outside the headquarters of the Robert Carmichael Foundation, where a small crowd gathered for the anniversary ceremony. A young volunteer offered her an arm, but she smiled and waved him off gently. "I've made it up these steps before," she said. "I'll manage again." Inside, the lobby had been transformed. Along one wall stretched the Hall of Stories, a gallery of framed photographs, each paired with a brief inscription. Faces of those the foundation had helped. A retired teacher from Green Bay, a widower from La Crosse, a nurse who had rebuilt her life after her son's fraud conviction. In the center of the display hung a larger frame, an image of Ella herself, standing in front of her old garden. The caption beneath it simple and profound: "The woman who chose not to surrender." She paused there for a long moment. Her reflection mingled with the photographs, the past and present layered, like sunlight through glass. "Mom," a familiar voice said behind her. Ella turned to see Emily, poised and confident, clipboard in hand. Her daughter's hair was now streaked with silver, her eyes calm but bright, the same eyes Robert once had. Emily was no longer the uncertain woman, torn between love and loyalty. She was now the Foundation's executive director, overseeing dozens of programs and hundreds of volunteers. "You've built something incredible," Ella said softly. Emily smiled. "You gave me the chance to." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, its paper cream-colored and sealed with gold wax. "I was supposed to save this for later, but I want you to read it now." Ella unfolded the letter carefully. Emily's handwriting flowed across the page in neat, deliberate strokes. "Mom, there are still days I think about what I almost lost. You taught me that love isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about learning from it. Thank you for letting me find my way back. Thank you for teaching me what strength looks like when it's quiet. I love you." The words blurred as Ella's eyes filled. She pressed the letter to her chest for a moment before tucking it safely into her coat pocket. When it was time for the speeches, the audience rose as she approached the podium. Cameras flashed, and a hush fell over the hall. Ella adjusted the microphone. Her hands steadied despite the tremor of age. Her voice was soft but carried easily through the room. 5 years ago, I thought my story was over. I thought that losing trust meant losing everything. But it turns out, she paused, smiling faintly, it's never too late to defend yourself. Never too late to turn pain into purpose. Applause rippled through the crowd, gentle at first, then building into something thunderous. Ella looked out over the faces, survivors, families, advocates, and her daughter standing proudly among them. Later, when the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, Ella stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky above the city glowed with the last hues of twilight. She tilted her head back, eyes tracing the first faint stars appearing above the Capitol dome. "You were right, Robert," she whispered, her voice carried softly by the wind. "You always knew this day would come." And as the night settled gently around her, Ella Carmichael smiled, at peace, her legacy secured, her story complete.